Rosebud.
Nuggies, get your nuggies! 4 pieces, homemade mayo, farm to factory, only 4 for a dozen, more or less. Still no customers. Oh, hello there. Hey, can I interest you in some nuggies? No? Then how about some nice hot homemade mayonnaise? No, wait. I've got something to say. For free. And maybe for a few commercials worth of ad revenue. No, wait. This is actually important. It's about how the media can manipulate the sentiments of millions of people without presenting a broad enough perspective to do justice to the truth. And it's about Superman. So we've been reading Superman, the unauthorized biography by Glenn Weldon, a good book by the way, and he points out that at various times in Superman's long comic book history, the writers at DC have killed off the Man of Steel for different reasons, that lasted for different periods of time, typically one issue. Here are just a few examples. In 1966, Superman issue number 188, The School for Super Assassins, a villain known as Zunile, the Murder Man, arrives on planet Earth and kills Superman with radio waves that are somehow traced with kryptonite, the only substance in the universe that can harm Superman. A robotic look-alike of Superman comes to his aid and revives him, allowing Superman to save the day. Huh? Then in 1971, in World's Finest, number 207, Superman and Batman, A Matter of Light and Death, Clark Kent is hypnotized by magic. Batman uncovers the plot with his psychedelic detective powers, but in the struggle with the villains, Superman is killed by the power of Satan's staff. But Batman stops the villains, and Superman turns out not to really be dead, and the villains themselves are double-crossed by the evil Dr. Light, who turns out to be behind the entire plot all along as a mastermind. But then Superman and Batman team up and defeat Dr. Light and destroy the Satan staff. And finally, Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent watch a magic show. Wow. Then in 1977, in the Justice League of America issue number 145, The Carnival of Souls. An evil wizard in league with the power of a demon invades the Justice League satellite and kills Superman with black magic. Boy, this really does sound like the 70s, doesn't it? I mean, how metal is that? Anyway, a character known as the Phantom Stranger appears and leads the Justice League to do battle with the evil wizard in another dimension known as the Carnival of Souls, which is a literal carnival with rides and everything. Eventually, the demon turns on the wizard, and the Phantom Stranger brings Superman back to life with superpowers that are as broad as whatever the writers need them to be. So basically, he's just like Doctor Strange. Of course, in these goofy old Silver Age adventures, Superman always comes back to life or turns out to have never really been dead in the first place, thanks to convenient contrivances or last-minute twists in the story. And for good reason, too. Superman is DC's most iconic character, the original superhero, and the mascot of the company. If they killed off Superman, DC was gonna have to replace the irreplaceable. But who remembers the mass hysteria that surrounded 1992's Death of Superman comic book series, involving a stock villain not so subtly named Doomsday? It would go on to be one of the most successful comic book publishing events in history, and largely, this was fueled by the fact that the American news industry picked up the story and proceeded to sensationalize this event in a way that was really surprising. Why were all these stuffy suits and news anchors talking about a comic book character? The only people that didn't seem surprised were at DC. It's almost like they expected the public attention. Everywhere there were news articles incredulously proclaiming the death of Superman. It was also heavily discussed on television, including a feature on Headline News and a skit on SNL. DC was really maybe gonna kill off Superman. It was the end of an era. Essayist and op-ed columnist Frank Rich wrote an editorial in the New York Times titled, "Term Limits for Superman. Yes, it's time for him to go," in which he celebrated the death of Superman as symbolic of a shift in American culture and politics. The conservative moralizing and toxic masculinity of America from the 1940s to the early 60s, which Superman no doubt embodied, was no longer in slow decline, but as with Superman himself, was finally coming to its end. According to Glenn Weldon, Jay Leno even wore a black armband on The Tonight Show in solemn commemoration of the event, a gesture no doubt welcomed by DC Comics themselves, since it was the same black armband that came packed in with select issues of the Death of Superman comic book. The story arc itself would comprise 7 issues across various DC Comics series, such as the Justice League, Action Comics, and the Adventures of Superman, but the ultimate issue would be Superman Volume 2, issue number 75, with the black cover, in which Doomsday and Superman would end their gratuitously violent showdown, with both the villain and the hero simultaneously killing each other off. It ended in a stalemate. So yeah, basically the whole thing played out like an episode of Dragon Ball Z. But Superman was dead, and the comic book would become a smash hit everywhere it was sold. Drawing large lines that required limits of 1 per customer, and selling millions of issues everywhere, making DC an estimated $30 million in the process. But of course, all of this was bullshit. DC knew it. Of course they never actually planned to permanently kill off Superman. Not any more than they had at any other time in the past. Avid comic book readers knew better. To them, there was nothing new about a Death of Superman story. The inevitable chain of events was almost painfully obvious. From the moment the news broke, Superman would fight a supervillain, give up his life to save Earth, and in due time, Superman would be back fully alive, which of course is exactly what came to pass, as a matter of fact, and Superman has continued on in various forms for roughly 30 years now. Yet at the time, no doubt, there was mass hysteria about this. Shops weren't just selling out to kids and teens, or aging geeks who grew up on the silver and golden age of comics, but absolute outsiders as well were now participating, and in large numbers. People who never read a comic book in their entire lives were out waiting in lines, scooping up as many copies of the Death of Superman as they could possibly muster, preferably the sealed version with the black cover. Why? Because DC and the news machine were marketing the Death of Superman not for its originality or quality as a story, not even for the historic significance, but rather for the book's potential as a lucrative collector's item. People clamored for a copy of the Death of Superman because they believed, or were led to believe, with the special commemorative packaging, that the Death of Superman was going to become a lucrative investment, worth maybe millions of dollars in some unknown future. And why wouldn't they think this? This was the era of Beanie Babies, comic book auctions, and a hot speculators market surrounding things like baseball cards that saw the quick rise and fall of an entire industry that left a few clever individuals much wealthier after its ruin. Cards and comics were basically the Bitcoin of the 90s, and like Bitcoin, you didn't have to understand it or enjoy it in order to garner an opportunity to make a quick profit in dollars. You just needed someone willing to buy what you already had. And so standing in line for a Superman comic book was just a strip mall version of the dreaded Yukon Trail. Well, it's been almost 30 years, and it is indeed possible to get a near mint, sealed copy of The Death of Superman for less than $12.50 on eBay. In fact, it's super easy. But by no means is $12.50 anything to scoff at, because you can buy some of my world famous chicken nuggies for that exact same price. Nuggies, get your nuggies! 4 pieces to a box, homemade hot mayo, farm to factory, straight to your mouth, 4-piece chicken nuggies! But you can imagine how much more someone would have made if instead they had invested their Superman money in, say, something like stock in Amazon or Apple Computer, or even just a new pair of pants that weren't somehow stained with Cheeto dust. Obviously, with hindsight, we could imagine ourselves making any number of better decisions, such as my decision to get a degree in theology. Nuggies, get your nuggies here! Hot homemade mayo, fresh from the factory! Nuggies, get your nuggies!
I'd like to order some nuggies.
Sure, buddy, that'll be $12.50.
$12 for nuggies?
Oh boy, another dumb zoomer who doesn't know anything about economics. Well, you see, dude, I gotta make a profit, but each box of these cost me $3.35 for my supplier. Then, you know, because of Putin, I gotta pay these stupid high gas prices to transport them. I had to get all these cute little boxes on Etsy, I needed a table from Walmart, and it's sunny out here, so I needed this thing, plus of course I've gotta pay Javier over here, so he can, you know, do his thing. Right, Javier? This is an expensive operation, and unless I sell these Nuggies for $12.50, I won't be able to make enough back on my investment to even be able to feed my family tonight.
So, why don't you just, eat the Nuggies?
Ha! What?
If, your family's hungry and stuff, why not just buy Nuggies for them to eat? Since, you have enough money for that, right?
My word, you Zoomers certainly are economically challenged. If I don't make a profit, how am I supposed to be able to buy them Nuggies tomorrow? Or the day after that?
You could, get a job? I have one, and that's how...
Okay, Zoomer, are you gonna buy some Nuggies or what?
I think these are cold. And why does that one have bite marks?
Javier, have you been stealing my chicken?
I gotta go, dude. Later.
Hey, sir, what about your chicken, sir? I've already put it in the bag, sir. That means you're legally obligated to take it and pay me. Wait, come back. Please, come back. At least leave me a positive review on Yelp. Hey, come back. Ah, man. Not a smart professional move, guys. Anyway, as it pertains to the death of Superman, was there ever any question, really? It was a comic book that was printed by the millions and sold at virtually every magazine and comic rack across the United States. Now here's an actual worthwhile lesson in economics. If ever anyone makes a lot of something that's really easy to get, then the long-term resale value for that thing is bound to be very low. By the early 90s, the original Superman comic book, Action Comics #1 from June of 1938, was selling for tens of thousands of dollars at auctions. So it's easy to see why some people might assume that the death of comics' biggest hero might also be worth big money down the road. But the reason Action Comics #1 was so valuable wasn't just its historical significance, but the fact that it was extremely rare by the 1990s. When the first issue of Action Comics was published by National Allied Publications in 1938, it was an upstart venture, and they simply didn't print the thing in vast quantities because it had yet to establish an audience. And no one knew that Superman, created by Jerry Siegel and Joel Shuster, was going to become this massive cultural icon. Sure, he was featured on the cover, smashing this poor dude's car.
Oi vey!
But in reality, the Superman story was really just a small part of the first volume, which was comprised of all sorts of classic adventure stories about things like cowboys, explorers, newsmen, each by different writers and artists. Other than the cover, Superman was only about 20% of the first volume. Substantial, yet still just a small part. Thus the kids who bought an issue of Action Comics #1 for a dime in 1938 didn't think to do anything special in order to preserve their cheaply printed, highly fragile paper-based comic books over the next 70 years. They probably rolled it up, carried it around, stuffed it in their bags, and then finally had it thrown out by their moms within weeks of that first purchase. To date, it's estimated that only 50 to 100 intact copies of the first issue of Superman even exist at all. And because it's the first superhero comic book ever made, everyone wants it, and some people are willing to pay dearly to get it. But this certainly isn't the case with the death of Superman. Millions of issues were printed in anticipation of high demand, and many thousands of comic book collectors have carefully preserved those issues, which were sealed within plastic packaging in order to further preserve their integrity. And then, of course, there's the fact that Superman never actually stayed dead, which sort of diminishes the historical significance of what was flaunted as a monumental historical event. This makes me wonder to what degree the publishers of DC may have colluded with the news media to transform this simple comic book story into a monumental publishing venture and investment scheme by would-be millionaire comic book speculators. When the news first reached the public that DC was planning on killing off Superman, it was in the form of a so-called leak. But it's entirely possible that someone from DC deliberately leaked this sensational bit of information explicitly for the purpose of getting early buzz generated for the comic. Further, this makes me wonder, to what degree did DC lie about the future plans for the Man of Steel? Did they really mean to imply that there would never be another Superman story in the future? Just as comics were beginning to experience a resurgence in popularity thanks to the influence of popular superhero movies and TV shows? Headline News interviewed DC editor Mike Carlin in 1992, and this is what he said when asked whether or not Superman was actually going to stay dead.
We don't know what death means to a Kryptonian. we may find out.
And this is what Mike Carlin said when asked about why Superman was dying in the first place.
After 50 some odd years, to get people to notice, sometimes you have to go to extremes.
Well, that certainly does sound desperate and a bit cynical. Now, I'm not sure there's justification for dismissing the Death of Superman episode as the accidental result of a slow news day. I kinda think DC needed the attention, probably because in 1992, Marvel was kicking DC's butt, thanks to the popularity of Spider-Man and the X-Men.
After 50 some odd years, to get people to notice, sometimes you have to go to extremes.
Or I don't know, dude, you could just make a better product, right? That's what I've done here, after all, with my Nuggies and hot homemade mayonnaise. Nuggies, get your Nuggies! Hot homemade mayo, 4 for a dozen! Anyway, it makes me wonder how other commercial entities or vested interests might possibly collude with the supposedly truth-telling news outlets in order to sell us a lot more of something that we wouldn't necessarily want or need otherwise. It's good to keep your guard up and to think critically about everything you hear on TV or read in the newspaper. It always helps to wonder, what could they be trying to sell me this time? And better yet, is this really something that's beneficial? Like Nuggies, get your Nuggies! Nuggies, get your Nuggies! Hot homemade mayo, 4 for a dozen, Nuggies! And of course, long live Superman! End.